Good afternoon, everyone. We are at Judges chapter 4. We have started to see a number of judges being raised by God to lead the nation at this time. There was no more Joshua. And so God raised up individuals who rose up among them and although they are called judges, while they do judge cases, they're not really legal law judges in that sense. The idea of judges here would be very much leaders who would lead them in the way that they ought to walk. Not quite as kings in that absolute power, but by nature of their character, that God has given them specific wisdom to do certain things. And so that's why they are called judges. And this entire period is about judges, about individuals who are raised by God. And so in the previous chapter, we saw the judges that were raised by God, starting from uh, Ehud. Now, Ehud became the first of the judges. And then at the end of the chapter, we are also told that there was Shamgar. Now, that's two of the judges at the time, and they actually had peace for about 80 years. Now, during that time, when they had peace, everything was fine in the days of Ehud and then led by Shamgar. In chapter 4, we continue. Then Ehud himself died. And then the children of Israel again, which means that they had done that, and we saw that in chapter 3, they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, again, I have mentioned to you when they did Ra, which is evil, it is always in the eyes of the beholder. Now, the eyes of the beholder looked at by God that the actions that they did, the things they did, is not congruent to what God had wanted them to do. That was the idea of verses like these. So, understand good and evil is always viewed from the idea of the eyes of the person who is looking at the event. Now, as a result, and you can see in verse 2, it says, and then, so the word so is an and then idea. And then God sold them into the hand of Yabin, the king of Canaan, who reigned in Hadzor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who dwelt in Haroshet Hagoyim. Now, let's break this down a little bit. There are a few verses that we need to spend some time on, and this is the first. Again, God sold them. Now, the idea of selling them is not about money. So don't take it as a modern day idea. You can think of it as surrender. God surrendered them into the hand of Yabin. Yabin is the king of Canaan. So we are now talking not of Moab, we're now talking about Canaan. And he reigned in Hadzor, which is in the north. The commander of his army is Sisera, and he dwelt in Haroshet Hagoyim, also around that area. Now, each time you see this pattern, when God surrendered them into the hands of the enemies, they would cry. And so the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. For Jabin had 900 chariots of iron, and for 20 years he had harshly oppressed the children of Israel. So the cycle is always when there's good peace, the judges were there, everything was nice, and then the judges died and they went ahead and did something else. Now, why did they do that? Is that each time when there is peace, there is a long period. So a period of 80 years is actually a very long period. You probably see about two or three generations of people. And as the generations drew by, they tend to wane in their obedience to God. And in the very last of those generations, they might as well do something else that God didn't want them to do. And so they did evil in the eyes of God. And then God sold them or surrendered them into the hands of Yabin. And you must understand, Yabin then was already there. But when God says he surrendered the children of Israel into the hands of Yabin, it means that Yabin had the ability to suppress the Israelites. His army was strong, 900 armored vehicles. Armored vehicles. Now, understand, armored vehicles only work on the ground, it doesn't work on the hill. But they had chariots of iron, meaning they cannot be pierced by just spear and arrow, and they are very hardy and being drawn by horses will go into battle, and they are perhaps you can think of them as the most ferocious vehicle at the time of warfare. And for 20 years, that's like it is one generation of them, he had harshly oppressed the children of Israel and they cried out to God. That's what it means. Cried out to God towards the 20 years. Now, in verse 4, we will see what God did. In verse 4, we see Devorah. Now, Devorah is the name of the next judge. And he's also called Navi'ah. A Navi'ah is the feminine word for Navi. And so Navi'ah would be understood as a prophetess, where she would be able to have supernatural visions and dreams with God. He is the wife of Lapidot, right? Lapidot. And she judged Israel at that time. So this is the time of Yabin, the king of Canaan. She would sit under the palm tree of Devorah between Ramah and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim. Now, this is the nurse of Rachel, if I'm not mistaken, the nurse of Rachel. And this is quite interesting because it is located at a place where it was under the palm. The nurse of Rebecca. Devorah was the nurse of Rebecca, and perhaps this would be the palm tree that was planted at the gravesite of Devorah. And she, by the way, is also known as Devorah. And she would she would sit between Ramah and Bethel. This is the location of that palm tree in the mountains of Ephraim. The children of Israel came up to her for judgment. Now, this is interesting because you would find that this come up is because she is in the mountain. She is not in the valley. That's why it's always going up to the mountain. It is also interesting at the time that they do not find it awkward to meet up with a woman because it is very rare in the history of the Israelites that you find a woman coming out into the foreground. But Devorah was known as a prophetess, and she sits in the mountains of Ephraim, and everyone came to see her. And then she sent and called for Barak, the son of Avi-Noam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, which is in the north, and said to him, now one of the tradition. So I would put here tradition. By tradition, Barak is known as the husband of Deborah. But I leave it there without much to say because it's not in the text. Something for you to think about. Not that important. He called out to Barak and says, has not the Lord God of Israel commanded, go and prepare troops at Mount Tabor. Mount Tabor is in the north. It's at the eastern end of the Megiddo Valley. He says, take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and the sons of Zebulun. Now, these would be the tribes nearby. And against you, I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Yabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude at river Kishon, which is on the, well, I guess you can say on the center or towards the center of the Jezreel Valley. And when you fight, I will deliver him into your hand. Now, this is what God says. I want you, Barak, to go to Mount Tabor. Sisera will be at the river Kishon, which is the lower ground. You are at the higher ground. And you get 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun. Zebulun will be all ready for you to go. And then I will prepare the fight and you will win because I will deliver him into your hand. So that is what Deborah said. Has not the Lord God of Israel commanded? And so Barak said to her, if you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. This seems to be a very interesting conversation. You have to go together. Why? It's because Deborah is the prophetess. That she has heard from God. She has the communication with God. And in order to trust that, Barak would want Deborah to go with him. In verse 9, she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, there will be no glory for you in the journey you are taking, for the Lord will sell. Now, notice this is the same word. God sold the children of Israel to Yabin. This one is also the same word, sell, and you would think of it as surrender. This is not the normal idea of buying and selling. He will surrender Sisera into the hand of a woman because if I go, I will be the leader, not you. If you go by yourself, then Barak will be the leader. But unfortunately, if Deborah go, then God will surrender Sisera into a hand of a woman. And this in itself will be even more shameful. Then Deborah arose, went with Barak to Kadesh. And Barak called Zebulun, Naphtali to Kadesh. He went up Mount Tabor with 10,000 men under his command, and Deborah went up with him. Now we go on to a next passage, and it discusses a relative of Moses. This is in verse 11. This is Heber, the Kenite, the children of Hovav, the father-in-law of Moses. How is it that there are so many different names for the father-in-law of Moses? But nevertheless, we would see that these are not names, but they are also titles. Jethro, Ruel, and now Hovav. the father-in-law of Moses, had separated himself from the Kenites, pitched his tent near the terebinth tree at Zaanaim, which is beside Kadesh. And so here you find that at Kadesh, they are to fight that whole area, Kadesh. But on one side, you have Mount Tabor. And on the other side, you have the river. And so now we have the tent pitch there at Kadesh. And they reported to Sisera that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, right here. So Sisera gathered together all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron. Again, I want to point out to you, whenever you have chariots, they do not climb mountains. They will stay in the valley. And all the people who were with him from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon. So the river Kishon will flow through Kadesh. Then Deborah said to Barak, in verse 14, he says, "Rise up, for this is the day in which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. Has not the Lord gone out before you?" Now, this is a time when it's been long after Joshua. At the time of Joshua, when they fought every battle, they were very confident because they trusted in God to open the way as the Lord fought with them. Now, after that, they all went back to their own locations. And during the time of the judges, there wasn't such a leader like Joshua. But then God, in this point in time, raised up Deborah to say this: God has gone out before you. And so Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men. 10,000 men following him, and the Lord routed Sisera. Now, in verse 15, the word routed, at least in the English, you think that God destroyed them. But that's not what it means. It tells us of an idea of confuse. God confused Sisera and all his chariots and all his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. Now, this whole idea of confused is quite a word, because this word confused is also having the idea of some a noisy engagement. It became confusing. They were troubled, and then they were, well, I guess you can say, then they were, it was all in chaos. I guess you can say this, chaos. That is how this particular word is used. So this word is a picture, actually. It says God went there and caused massive chaos, confusion. It was all very noisy with the chariots and his army. They didn't know what happened when the 10,000 men came down, and they screamed, they shout, and that was the whole confusion, and they were stuck. Now, this whole picture here comes from this one word, and this one word here is Yaham, comes from a word that is to make chaos and confusion. And this is the first time Sisera didn't know what to do. He got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. Why? Because in that confusion, this whole idea of routing can also give us a picture in some other passages that this came from a lot of noise that God had caused. And the noise can be from lightning and thunder, and would have caused the ground to be muddy, and the chariot got stuck. And so he couldn't run away with his chariot. So all of these are in that one word. So I'm just giving you that as a background because it's kind of hard to understand how is it that suddenly he couldn't ride his chariot. He's got to get off his chariot, and then he ran away, right? He ran away, which is a very unusual situation. Whenever you read chariots, it means that they are strong. Something really supernatural did happen, but the details were left out. Barak chased the chariots and the armies as far as Haroshet Hagoyim, where Sisera lived, but Sisera wasn't there. And all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. Now, Sisera had fled away on foot, just now we saw, and he went to the tent of Yael. Yael was the wife of Heber the Kenite. And as Heber the Kenite was living there, he was living there in peace with king of Hazor, which is Yabin, and the house of Heber the Kenite. So in this case, when Sisera fled on foot to this area of this area itself, I guess you could say this whole area was where Heber the Kenite had stayed at Kadesh. Uh, it is interesting. Now we see that Sisera thought it was safe, and he went into the tent of Yael and not Heber. That's the surprising idea that we need to sort out. Heber is the husband. Sisera was a man. But he didn't go into the tent of the man, but he went into the tent of the woman. So understand this, that in the ancient case, if there was the tent of a woman, the soldiers would not just go in, and that would be very improper. They would have to ask permission to go into the tent of a woman. But Sisera, knowing that trend or that culture, went in to hide, because if he hides in the tent of Heber, they could go in and slaughter him. But if he goes into the tent of a woman, she is weak. So the women folk are seen to be weak, and then they are seen to have a sense of a protection for him. And so Yael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me. Do not fear. Do not be afraid. Come in." Basically, Yael invited him to come in. And when he had turned aside with her, and this is important to note, he went into the tent. She covered him with a blanket so that he is comfortable. And because just now it was all the supernatural thunder, lightning, rain, and all that stuff, he must have been wet. And so he covered him with a blanket to keep him warm. And then he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." And so she opened a jug of milk and gave him drink and covered him. Now, what actually did happen in all this is he got comfortable to fall asleep. So the covering and the milk, it all helps him just go to sleep. And so he said to her, "Stand at the door of the tent." if any man comes and inquires of you, remember I said the men of the day do not just come into a woman's tent. They will always ask. And so if they ask, is there any man here? And you shall say no. That's to protect Sisera. And that was what Sisera thought, right? That's what Sisera thought. We come to verse 21. Then Yael, Hevez's wife, she took a tent peg. Now, this idea of a tent peg, this is not small. In the modern day, we call it a nail. And a tent peg is like a nail. You have the tent, right? And so what they do is the tent peg is used to peg in the tent so that it doesn't fly off. So this is the peg. Yael took that tent peg. Then she took and this is English word and we call it a hammer. I guess you could say that it is something of a piercing tool in her hand. Something that you use to pierce. And so the hammer would be uh, something with a big head, with a handle, and then she would take the tent peg to pierce, and that's how it's done when you peg the tent. And then she went softly to him. Now, this idea of softly is it's not quite softly, right? I guess you could say she went secretly. Now the picture is this. Secretly means Sisera wouldn't know. And as she stepped in, she was very careful where she stepped. So the translator used the word softly to describe that kind of a careful walk, sneaking up. Maybe you could use the word sneak up to him. And then at the side, she drove the tent peg into his temple. Now, this idea of the temple is the side of the head. Side of head. And it's interesting that this side of head is the thinnest side. The thinnest. So the temple would be just behind the eyes, and that's the softest and the thinnest. And the moment the peg went in, it went straight in. And you see, it went down into the ground. Now, how was that ever possible? So Sisera would have been sleeping on the side. Sleeping on the side. If you slept on the side, what actually would have happened is that the tent peg would have pierced all the way into the ground. That is what happened. He was fast asleep and weary. He didn't know, and he didn't know when he died. With the tent peg all the way into the ground. And then, as Barak pursued Sisera, Yael came out to meet him and said, "Come, I will show you the man whom you seek. You are looking for him, and when Barak went into her tent, and there lay Sisera dead with a peg in his temple, like this. On that day, God subdued Yabin, the king of Canaan, in the presence of the children of Israel. Understand this word. Subdued is humble, humiliated, brought down very low. And the king of Yabin, the king Yabin, has no more clout. And the children of Israel were not afraid of him anymore. And so the hand, every time you see the hand by itself, this would be the power. The ability of the children of Israel to defend herself grew stronger and stronger against Yabim, king of Canaan, until they had destroyed Yabim, the king of Canaan. There was no more Sisera. The fights were getting stronger and more violent, and the children of Israel overcame the power of Yabim, king of Canaan. And with this ended the 20 years of oppression. And so, what we find here in chapter 4 essentially are two women, Devorah, the prophetess, who led the charge against Yabin with Sisera. And so Barak did the warfare. And then we find the second woman, Yael, Hever's wife, had ultimately killed Sisera with a stroke. And both of them could be seen in our story in Judges chapter 4 as the heroes or the heroines of the day. And with this, we come to the end of our lesson today in Judges chapter 4. Mo